What's up, everyone? Floating Vent Guy here. So this is the start of our podcast series and our adventure into podcasting. So I thought what better way to start podcasting than with how do we breathe? So bear with me while we get used to this different format, and we'll try to go over this in a way that's educational, fun, and we'll be venturing into different topics. So how do we breathe? Which is a general sort of topic. However, I think it's important because before we get into positive pressure breathing and the mechanical ventilator, we should probably understand how people breathe with negative pressure. So this is a great representation, which is why I use the GIF. If we remember that all breathing is essentially based on Ohm's law, which is V equals IR, V meaning the change in something, in this case pressure, is equal to the flow in the resistance. So when you have a change in pressure, you're going to have a flow of something, and that flow of something is going to be proportional to the resistance. So in this situation, when we start breathing, we're going to start from an area of higher pressure, which is sort of this big triangle that we have, that will flow to an area of lower pressure, which is this small triangle that I put here. Once these pressures equalize, there's no more flow. So a simple representation is if you start a breath, so from expiration, so at the end of expiration, and we're going to start inspiration, the airway pressure at your mouth is 0. Now, it's atmospheric pressure, which is some number, which is important to know, but it's easier to just realize that it's 0 because number one, that doesn't change, and number two, it's conceptually easier, and it's sort of accepted that it's 0. So the pressure at your mouth is 0. The pressure in your lungs is also 0. Your lungs is also 0 because you have ended a breath. Now, there's two other pressures that you should know, which is sort of the intrapleural pressure and the transpulmonary pressure. So let's just say the intrapleural pressure, which because of the outward recoil of the chest wall and the inward recoil of the lung tissue, being in this balance, it settles out the intrapleural pressure of around -5. So when you start a breath, you drop your diaphragm. As your diaphragm drops, that intrapleural pressure gets more negative. Since the intrapleural pressure is more negative, the pressure in your lungs, the alveolar pressure, gets more negative. So it moves from 0 to -1. So now there's negative pressure in your lungs, a smaller pressure, setting up a gradient. Are the numbers important? 0, 1, 5, 8. I don't think they're particularly important for the concept. Now, if you're taking an exam, the MCAT, some other tests, USMLE, boards, poem boards, who knows? Maybe these numbers are important, but to me, they're not exactly important. It's the concept that's important. So the concept is because you dropped your diaphragm, you set up negative pressure in your lung, which then provides a pressure gradient for air to flow from higher pressure, the mouth, which is 0, or atmospheric pressure, to lower pressure, which is now your lung. So your lung, because you've created space inside of it, that space is filled now with air, essentially. And at some point, the pressures equalize. At some point, the pressure in your lung becomes higher because now you've filled it with air. So now, since we've filled it with air and it's a little bit higher, +1, than your airway pressure, which is still 0 because this is atmospheric pressure, which is not really 0, but we're going to accept that it's 0 because it's easier to work with. Now you've set up the reverse, which is a gradient from inside of your lung to the atmosphere. So air will flow from your lung to the atmosphere until it reaches that point of 0, where now the pressures have equalized 0 and 0. As air flows out, this transpulmonary pressure goes back to its original number, which is closer to -5. Then we restart the cycle. We end at everything is 0, so there's no flow of air, and your transpulmonary pressure is -5. This is important because remember, when we talk about any type of positive pressure breathing, whether it be non-invasive or the mechanical ventilator, this number is not going to be 0. It's going to be something much higher, 10, 12, 30, who knows what it'll be. That's going to be based on the lungs and the mechanics of the lungs. So there's going to be a tremendously higher airway pressure, which is then going to force air into the lungs because you're setting up such a high gradient. So I think a good way to start with the mechanical ventilator in general is to understand how we breathe negative pressure. So I think because of the nature of this material, it's probably going to be better to be with video rather than like a true sort of podcast format. I'll be growing along the way with this new format, and hopefully you guys will enjoy it. It's going to be on Spotify and YouTube under the same handle. And the working title of the show at this point is the Peak Inspiratory Podcast. So thanks for joining, and hopefully this was helpful.